Welcome to National Security Law Today, the podcast of the Standing Committee on Law and National Security. I'm Elisa Poteet. I'm always here in my individual capacity. Tonight, we're going to bring you a lovely conference that took place on June 4th. Before we get to that, there's been an enormous amount of news about emerging technologies, and we spent the last almost 20 episodes talking about AI and how it's going to impact national security. But there is another technology that is closer on the horizon than it was before AI, and that is quantum computing. Last week, the Department of War issued a policy statement, a strategy, if you will, on how it is going to deal with quantum computing. And why is that important? Because the use of cryptography is critical to everything that we do in the national security space. And without it, our systems are not protected and classified in the way that we would hope. So the fact that somebody is thinking about the impact of this technology and drafting a policy, which I'm going to wager you dollars against donuts, did not just start with this administration, because this has been something on the horizon. But we've mentioned in a number of podcasts that Q-Day, the date on which quantum is a reality, is now very close, in less than 3 short years. The reason for that is that AI has made it possible to move closer to that date. NIST, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, has actually described what quantum computing is, and we will give you a hyperlink. It is going to be important to have a strategy to protect our encrypted cryptographic systems. Separately from that, there is a new executive order 14411, which also has to do with a demand for government agencies to have a policy in place to manage the deployment of this system, which, again, can occur within 31 months if you believe the current predictions. Separately, there is concern that this technology be protected from foreign actors. And at least NextGov is reporting that there is already a group of individuals in the federal law enforcement community that are prepared to respond to the need to protect this technology. And I would assume this is going to take the form of things like task forces. But in any event, we announce that now because over the next few weeks, we're going to be migrating slightly off of AI and moving into this new emergent technology, which is little understood. But the good news is we'll be hearing from actual scientists and people who do understand this instead of lawyers who are like, yeah, I wasn't that great at math. I can write Python, but beyond that, I'm not feeling it. But we'll have somebody on to explain this and go over it. And that will be the topic that we cover over the next few weeks, along with a further discussion of AI and some of the challenges that are suddenly emerging in the course of the conflict with Iran. Now, on a separate note, as we're recording this Monday evening, June 29th, there are still talks ongoing with Iran, although the actual bombing and attacks from both sides, Iran attacking other Gulf nations, Sunni nations, and the United States bombing Iran. So this is still occurring while these discussions are taking place right now. But importantly, it seems like it's focused on the Straits of Hormuz and how that will be controlled going forward as a result of this deal. If you have questions about what it must be like to negotiate this kind of thing, we did a podcast last week with Brian Egan. It's multi-topographical. It is a difficult situation, but it's a good podcast to hear if you want to understand what it looks like. More importantly, how it might compare with the JCPOA. We're going to turn now to a reunion, if you will, of 20 years of the National Security Division of the Department of Justice. And this is audio from a lunch presentation that was held here in Washington, D.C. It included the Assistant Attorney General for National Security, Ken Wainstein, John Carlin, John Demers, Matt Olsen, and it was moderated by Kelli Andrews, who was Chief of Staff at some point to John Demers. So I think it might be interesting to hear this, bearing in mind that the National Security Division was, if you will, the spawn of the original 9/11 Review Commission that looked at ways that the government could improve its response to terrorism, straddling both the classified and highly intelligence-laden world with that of the sort of reactive and after the fact criminal justice system. and how those two things could coexist, and also encompassing the need for Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court authorizations in order to conduct proper collection of intelligence into individuals, and what happened when there were coterminous needs to collect information for intelligence purposes, but secondarily, there was the potential for a criminal disruption of any individuals or groups. So the conversation, I hope you enjoy it, will follow, and we will see you with a full NSLT next week. Enjoy the 4th of July. And remember, this is America's 250th anniversary as a democracy that needs to have a national security program. We're going to be talking a lot more about that in the coming months as well. But I'm sure we're going to be discussing it a lot at the fall conference, which is going to take place on October 8th and 9th. And if you would like to meet people, lawyers who are very interested in this topic, and you sort of want to rub elbows and meet in vivo as opposed to online where it isn't real, then it might be a good idea to plan to show up. And we will put in the notes to this podcast a way for you to contact the committee and ultimately get a ticket and show up. So we hope you enjoy this podcast, and we'll see you next week.
Well, again, welcome everyone. As I said at the outset, we're here to mark the 20th anniversary of the establishment of the National Security Division at the Department of Justice. We have with us 4 former Assistant Attorneys General who we will introduce in a moment. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Kelli Andrews. Kelli is Senior Director for Cybersecurity and Lawful Access Policy at Microsoft. She previously spent something on the order of a decade at the Department of Justice. Most recently as the Chief of Staff in the National Security Division. Before that has been at DHS, House Energy and Commerce, and no doubt other places. Kelli, I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started.
Great, thanks. Is it on?
I think it's on.
Well, everyone, welcome. This is so exciting. It's amazing just to think about 20 years since NSD was first established. And we have such an incredible panel today, which I am so pleased to get to spend some time asking them questions and just kind of going through a little bit about the department, how it started, how it's evolved, and the incredible work that the National Security Division has done over these past 20 years. I'm going to let each former Assistant Attorney General briefly introduce themselves. We will start with the first AAG for NSD, Ken Wainstein. To start, please be brief. I know you like to talk about yourself quite a bit, but we have
Settle in,
to get
folks.
through.
It might take a while. So I prefer to be called the George Washington of the National Security Division. Okay. Yeah, good to see everybody. Thanks for including me. Ken Wainstein. I'm in Mayor Brown here in D.C. and as Kelli said, it was the AAG NSD back 2006 to 2008.
And John Carlin, Paul Weiss now, and was at National Security Division from 2011 to 2016, and AAG from 2014 to 16.
Nice. And John Demers, and we're actually seated in order, although there's some missing pieces. But so I was in NSD actually with Ken originally and Matt when NSD got started in 2006. And then back as AAG from 2018 to 2021.
Hello, everybody. So good to see you all. I'm Matt Olsen. I was at the National Security Division with Ken and John at its inception, and then was most recently AAG from 2021 to 2025.
Well, all thank you so much for joining. I think we're going to start because when I think about the 20-year anniversary, and I think about kind of what was the mood of the country 20 years ago? Why did NSD first get formed? Ken, I feel like you're in a great position to kind of take us back a little bit to that time and maybe give us a little bit of sense of, you were obviously in the criminal division at the time, like how did the division get formed? What was the basis for it? And give us a little bit about kind of the threat landscape at that standpoint.
Yeah, sure. So, it's interesting. So 9/11 happens, and then of course, right after that, there's number of different studies and a lot of talk about how, one of the reasons 9/11 happened was the government wasn't situated, wasn't organized in a way that made sure that all the different parts of the government that are focused on international terrorism were talking to each other, the whole connect the dots issue. And so you had a number of different series of recommendations for changing the government, and you have ODNI get stood up, and NCTC to fuse all the counterterrorism intelligence. And DOJ was a little bit late to the game, and it wasn't until 2005 that, based on the recommendation of the, what's it called, Rob Silverman? Is that what
The WMD
WMD Commission, that they recommended that DOJ integrate its assets that are focused on international terrorism and transnational threats generally, but that was the counterterrorism section and the counterintelligence section that were in the criminal division, and then OIPR, the Office of Intelligence Policy Review, which became the Office of Intelligence, of course, the folks who in DOJ who represent the government before the FISA court. They were completely organizationally distinct, and the recommendation was to pull them together, put them in one division, appoint an assistant attorney general to oversee all of them. Also, importantly, for that assistant attorney general to act as the liaison to the intelligence community. So integrating DOJ's capabilities together within the department, but also integrating DOJ with the intelligence community. A lot of debate about that, as you remember. It wasn't a foregone conclusion that would be agreed to, but ultimately the president got behind it, Congress legislated it, got stood up on September 30th of 2006. And so look, at that point, we were still in the aftermath of 9/11. It was, the major focus was international terrorism, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, et cetera. But the challenges that we were dealing with were, obviously deal with that, but then there, as soon as we got in, there were a lot of, big ticket items on our plate. So the terrorist surveillance program, which had been the surveillance program that the president stood up in October of 2001. It was sort of on its last legs legally, or at least that's what the prediction was. And so one of the first people I met was this smart young guy, John Eisenberg, from OLC, who came in to talk about how we were going to deal with that. So, Matt and John and the rest of the team really took point on bringing in those surveillances under the FISA court authority, and then ultimately the Protect America Act and then the FISA Amendments Act. So the first challenge was dealing with the authorities that were, in jeopardy at that time. Another challenge was just standing up a new division, and I will say that, that I think this is evidence of how well it worked. And really why it worked is we had complete support across the board. Like Alice Fisher, the criminal division, you would think that maybe bureaucratically that person might want to be resistant. Totally supportive. Bob Mueller, wasn't a foregone conclusion that the FBI would be okay with us, trying to conduct stiffer oversight of FBI. He was very supportive. Anyway, so that challenge worked out. And I guess the last thing I'd mention that we often don't think about is, we were at a moment where the pendulum had swung from post 9/11. The government could do anything to further the counterterrorism effort, and there'd be very few questions asked on the Hill or elsewhere. That time had ended, and this was after Abu Ghraib, after the Patriot Act, the bruising Patriot Act reauthorization debate. And so it was really important for the division to take point on, showing that it was, and really doing so, protecting civil liberties. And that I think was a big ticket item for us. And Matt played a central role in standing up the oversight of the FISA operations and national security operations in the Bureau, which I thought was very important. So those are sort of the challenges that we saw. And then obviously there are a number of different other threats that were coming to the fore other than international terrorism, such as export controls and that kind of thing that we moved into, and then these guys really took it from there.
If I could, Kelly,
go
I just
ahead.
the other challenge that you dealt with, Ken, very well was just the challenge organizationally of bringing people together who had been told by everyone, by the courts, by Congress, by the executive branch, not to talk to one another, not to share information with one another. And all of a sudden, they're all stuck together in the same group. And they're being told, well, what fool is that you weren't talking to each other? And then now you should be talking to each other all the time. That's really difficult when you spent your career and you've been formed in one way of thinking about your job and the balance, and not the balance, but the way you should safeguard civil liberties. And then you're being told, no, you really need to do it this whole other way. And that was a big part, as I remember those first 2 years when you were there.
Yeah, but it proved up how the wisdom of the organizational change.
Yeah.
You put everybody together, and we'd have our morning meetings, and you'd have Pat Rowan, overseeing CT and counterintelligence, sitting in there with Matt, and that synergy was happening.
Yeah. No, it happened, but it wasn't easy.
Yeah, I just want to double down on the not easy part. I mean, it was really hard.
Yeah, it was easy for Ken, because he wasn't doing it.
I was taking naps and working out.
I hope people do appreciate what it was on Ken's shoulders, and I mean, I'm joking, but about it being not easy, but it really was hard to build a new division, the first new division in decades at the Justice Department. And yes, we had leadership support for taking the counterterrorism section and counter-espionage section from the criminal division, but that's a really hard bureaucratic thing to do. Those were like the crown jewels of the criminal division at that time, and they were taken and put into the national security, this new division. And then just a couple other points. One is, Ken very deftly uses a euphemism like the terrorist surveillance program was on its last leg legally. I mean, there was not really much of a leg to stand on for the terrorist surveillance program in 2005. It had been disclosed by the New York Times, and we were sort of asked to figure out how to put it on, again, euphemistically, a more firm legal footing. And that was really hard. And then John and I were together, often dealing with some crisis, some really hard thing that just happened, and we had to come up with an answer right away, and it would be like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and we'd have to we'd say, well, we need to go talk to Ken. So we would, of course, run down to the gym where we would find Ken on the exercise bicycle with his headphones on, so nobody would bother him. And have to try to convince him to come back up to the National Security Division to skip, where we can talk about this big problem. I know a lot of you know this is true. I can just tell that this resonates. So anyway, there were a lot of problems, a lot of challenges at the beginning.
I want to defend Ken because when he was on the exercise bike, he often had a Redwell with him and was willing to take questions, but was at the gym. The other aspect of it that was difficult seeing it from across the street at the time, I was at FBI, but I remember working with John Demers, was you had this organizational change that you were managing within the department, as you alluded to. You also had this question of where does the Department of Justice fit in with the intelligence community, and that pendulum shift was occurring, so you had a rewriting of the core executive branch authorities at the time, Executive Order 12333, and trying to figure out what is in this new constellation where now we have a Department of Homeland Security and a director of National Intelligence. Where does the FBI fit in? Where does the Justice Department fit in? What's the role of the Attorney General as the preserver of civil rights and civil liberties in the execution of that structure? And by no means still not settled questions, but at the time some vigorous debate about how that should play out. Mm-hmm. And Ken biked his way all the way through it. All the way through. That was good shape.
So he left us for the White House.
So, Ken, I know you obviously mentioned sort of course, Al-Qaeda and sort of the international terrorism focus when you first were the AAG. John Carlin, I would love to hear, because obviously you're second, I would love to hear a little bit about kind of the particular challenges that you saw when you joined NSD, first obviously as the principal deputy and then later on as AAG, particularly like on that threat landscape. Like what changed? And obviously coming over from the Bureau too, I'd be really interested. We're gonna go down the line because I wanna ask each of you this because I think it really illustrates like the evolving sort of threats that the country is facing.
Yeah, so looking back on it, first moving over, we were building on so much good work that had been done. So it wasn't that original startup struggle, and at the time, it's all about office space, right? They had escaped from the second floor corner to having their own offices with skiffs where the design, was you need to sit shoulder to shoulder to address these threats. But of course, people were not shoulder to shoulder because there was no such space. So we were there taking advantage of the fact that some people were now able physically to sit next to each other in a skiff. But when I went over originally, I recall, we thought that there had been this enormous success. And I remember going back, when you think of the founding story of the National Security Division, Bob Mueller used to tell the story of when he went to the president and after September 11th, and he went as the former prosecutor that he was, and he went into great factual detail about who they thought was responsible and how they were going to hold them to account. And the president essentially told him that that's not what he wants him to do, that that's a failure, and that while it may be necessary to prosecute after the fact, that the goal was to be intelligence-led, so see what the intelligence is telling you, and threat-driven. Where does it say, what does it predict about the threat? And then success is not prosecuting when families are grieving. Success is preventing an attack from occurring in the first instance. And that was just a fundamental mindset change for those who focused more on the criminal side of the system. So with that change and many other structural changes that had occurred, I think enormous success had been made against the old Al-Qaeda model. So if you think about that as investing an enormous amount of time and monetary resources in order to conduct an attack on a scale as spectacular as September 11th, the United States had gotten so effective at sharing intelligence across the law enforcement national security divide within government, and had gotten so successful at sharing it with other governments that it was not a good day to be the head of Al-Qaeda. And almost as soon as someone was announced in that position, they were hit with either lethal targeting or were otherwise disrupted, and they were unable to carry out a plan of that scale. So when I went over originally, my background was I was a computer hacking prosecutor and had led that side on the criminal side of the house, and I knew from the work that I had done there that if it was a nation state, I had great agents, but they would disappear behind this locked, closed, compartmented door, and I didn't see them again. And even when I coordinated that program nationally for the United States, on the criminal side, I did not know what was happening when it was a nation state. And China at the time was particularly active. When I went over to FBI, the door opened and I could see what was occurring. And they'd done an enormously effective job on the intelligence side of the house at mapping the intrusions into universities, into nonprofits. They would hop from there into corporations, and then you saw information leave the United States on a scope and scale that Keith Alexander, former head of the National Security Agency, called the largest theft in human history in terms of the volume. And when I say watch, I mean there really was a Jumbotron screen out at an undisclosed facility in Virginia, and we would watch in real time as it hopped, and you'd watch the information leave. They had a great visual of it. It did not feel, looking at that, like success, though. And when you consider that the mission was, we're not successful after the fact, but we're trying to disrupt this from occurring in the first instance, it did not feel like mission success. And so when I originally went over to National Security Division, we thought the international terrorism threat is somewhat receding, and we need to focus now on this new counterintelligence threat where the focus is on protecting national assets and trying to use all the legal tools of the division consistent with its founding. So that means the intelligence tools to see what the adversary is doing, but then tools like the regulatory regimes on sanctions, building on work that had been done on the export side of the house, and importantly, thinking about these national security cyber threats. And if you think about it, there were good reasons why the counterintelligence had not adopted what those countering terrorism had done. So the mindset of a lot of the folks who'd come up in that space was the old Cold War mindset. If you remember the case that later became that show, The Americans, that case was being taken down at the time, and you still had these Russian operations that required extensive planning And success really would be not disrupting it, but feeding inaccurate information. You didn't want to disrupt something like a 30-year plan to get a Russian in as an American citizen, because if you did, you might not find the new version of that plan. The problem was what we were seeing, and the former director of the FBI called this like a drunken gorilla burglarizing your house. China didn't, you could do this on scale now through cyber. If there was no cost, we weren't really learning anything in terms of strategic or even tactical intelligence. They were just stealing everything. So we had, our assessment day after day would be, they're taking everything. And so if we started to disrupt it, it wouldn't have the same type of cost as it would in the old Cold War model. So top threat there was moving to try to protect national assets. Now, as we were trying to do that pivot, and we can talk a little bit more about some of those cases, the terrorists changed their threat. So if you think of old Al-Qaeda using Western technology against us, in that case aviation, to do this large-scale spectacular attack, terrorism 2.0 or Al-Qaeda 2.0, the Islamic State, used another Western innovation that was provided to the world for free, which was social media, and operating from caves in Syria and in Iraq. They had come up with this model, and key to it, I'll tell one case story, but key to it was an individual, he was a British hacker, and this, I think, combines the cyber and the terrorism threats. British hacker named Farizi, who had been arrested for hacking and then got radicalized in prison, and in the UK. He then left the UK and moved to Raqqa, where he used his English language skills and social media to encourage people to both to join and fight, but also to kill where they lived, and tried to turn, in this case, using social media, not aircraft into weapons of mass destruction, but human beings into weapons, and encourage them to kill where they live. And this tactic was successful. There's one case that I think symbolizes the changes that we were trying to make at the time, and use the new structure of creating a Deputy Assistant Attorney General to protect national assets to do it, which is this Farizi case where a company just trying to do business in the US got hacked. The hacker stole personal identifiable information of the victim, so your customer information. The hacker was an extremist from Kosovo who had moved to Malaysia. He was around 19 years old, in part to get better access to broadband, so he could be a better hacker. He hacked into this company to make a buck, and it was a low dollar amount, like $500. From the company's perspective, it was an unsophisticated hack. But if they didn't work with the government, what they wouldn't have found out was that on the back end, this Kosovo hacker who had moved to Malaysia had entirely online formed a friendship with this British hacker who had moved to Raqqa, Syria, Farizi, and Farizi had convinced him to give him the personal information that he had stolen, and then Farizi couldn't care less about making a buck. He wanted to kill, and so he used that information to send out through social media the targets, and listed by name. He looked for those who looked like, because of the suffix on their email addresses, that they were law enforcement, and says to kill these people by name where they lived. We were able to disrupt that attack using all tools. CENTCOM announced publicly that they had done a missile strike that killed Farizi they killed the leader of that campaign where he lived in Raqqa, Syria. But in order to do that, think about that. It's the speed and scale of cyber. It's crossing criminal and national security authorities, and this was the new challenge. If you think about the challenge of sharing information at scale and speed within and between governments, this case posed a new problem that when I left, we were still figuring out how to tackle and trying to get better at tackling, which is almost all of this infrastructure on cyber is in private hands. How do we share information at the scale and speed with which you need to share it with the private sector to jointly combat this new type of threat?
So John Demers, I feel like this is a great starting point for sort of when you took over the division. Sort of what would you say would be kind of the top threats that you saw obviously cyber being one, sort of international terrorism waning, changing a bit, but interested in your views on that.
Yeah, I mean, well, first, I took a division devastated by the reign of Carlin, so there was a rebuilding. But no, actually, I hope there's actually two themes I think that are going to come out here. I'll just say them. And one is how the work of the division has been influenced by developments in technology, and that starts with what had to happen in terms of FISA changes to FISA. I mean, the rise of cyber and cybercrime and everything that that John was talking about and that the division did, and then on through, some of what Matt and I will talk about. And the second is, I think, just how the work of the division over 20 years has changed organically, always building on the work that had come before it very naturally. When I was there with Ken, it was counterterrorism all the time. That's what we did. There was a CES. It was kind of quiet, like John said. They were focused on traditional sort of Russian espionage. That's not a lot of cases. It's a lot of investigations, but it's not a lot of prosecutions. And when I came back, I think I still, and then of course in the meantime, like John said, there had been the ISIS threat, which was very real, really a resurgence in the terrorism threat, around 2014, 2015. But by the time I got there, that had really quieted down because of a lot of the good work the IC did, the military did, DOJ and the FBI did. And it really was all nation-state threats. I mean, that's an exaggeration. There's still a few folks trying to make it to the Middle East to join the Islamic State, even though there wasn't much to join by that time. And there were some folks who were still interested in causing damage here in the U.S., but the bulk of the work, and I remember one of my very first conversations was, one of the folks came over from the FBI, one of the EADs, and said, "You've got to help me. We are so resourced on the CT side, and we are so under-resourced on the CI side." Because it takes a while for the government, right, to shift. I mean, the threats often shift faster than the government's resources and workforce. And that was a big part of what was happening at that time on the IC side and on the DOJ side, was to make sure that we were adequately resourced and focused on the CI side. And the CI side is, definitely what John was just talking about on the cyber side, but more broadly. And look, obviously, when we talk CI, we're talking China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. We've been talking about them for years. We'll still be talking about them. Obviously, a lot happening right now on the Iran side of things. But, their use of new technologies, right, their use of cyber, like John said, to steal not just traditional political and military secrets, but to steal intellectual property. And so that was a big focus, when you and I were there, Kelly. And I see Adam Hickey is over there, and Adam was at the center of that as one of the deputies. And is really, creating a program where you're countering a lot of the different ways in which China was stealing intellectual property from the U.S. Part of that was through cyber, but part of that was through a lot of insider threat cases as well. A lot of that was, there was still some traditional espionage cases. There were a number of traditional espionage cases that we brought at the time. That was the big focus, I think, of those years, was on the economic espionage side, and that activity continues today. It's not like it's done, and most of that was China. Russia was involved and still is involved, but they were really after military and quasi-military technologies, so it was a little more limited in scope. Only the Chinese really had the ability to pull off widespread economic espionage. And so that was the goal. And the goal was, and I think this is true throughout, I mean, there's only so much NSD can do. What you really need to do is harness the U.S. Attorney's offices around the country and the FBI field offices around the country to investigate those cases, prioritize those cases, and bring those cases. And the National Security Division doesn't need like a cyber initiative or a China initiative to tell itself that it needs to be looking at these things. But it's very important for Main Justice to message what the Attorney General's priorities are out to the field, so that where the bulk of the people are in the department and not the Bureau, they can be focused on those threats. And that's an educational process, right? That's a messaging process. But when you do that, you just get a lot of great cases that come in the door from those field offices. And you see the extent of what's going on. And the other piece here, which the field offices have to ultimately take the lead on, is developing the relationships with the private sector. Right, I mean, as someone now, you're in the private sector, I mean, the folks you deal with are really the people in the field offices where you have operations. And those are the information sharing relationships that you have, or the folks you go to when you have an issue. It's a little less, it certainly doesn't start at main justice. You may end up there.
I do think, and Matt I do think though, sort of John Carlin and John Demers' point about this kind of working with the private sector, right? In cyber, and then sort of on these economic espionage cases, you really think about how the private sector more and more is being integrated into the national security conversation, and has to be, right? Especially with digital technology. So really interested, Matt, in kind of hearing your perspective of taking over, of course, a division in amazing shape when you got it, no doubt, from John Demers. But go right ahead.
I mean, in all seriousness, I mean, it is the theme that, John, you touched on this, that John Demers, that, each of us did truly benefit from the work of our predecessors, and there's so much continuity from one iteration of the National Security Division to the next over the past 20 years, notwithstanding the political changes, right, at the White House, and it's just such a source of strength of the division as it evolves. The other big theme is the mission just is evolving to meet the threat, and the threat is changing, and so the division is always adapting and changing to meet that threat. But to think about, on that first point I made, like the personification of that continuity is that I came in 2021. John, first of all, was one of the rare leaders, John Demers, who stayed into the next administration from the past at the request of the Justice Department, stayed for 5, 6, 7 months. I mean, part of it was I was having trouble getting confirmed, but so they needed to have somebody there. But John, graciously agreed to stay. With that, honestly, by everybody wanted him there, and also the 4 Deputy Assistant Attorney Generals that served under John Demers, George Toscas, Adam Hickey, Melissa McTuff, and Brad Wigman, all 4 career leaders, all stayed and served with me without missing a beat. And they are the people who are running all the programs and all the work that we're talking about. And that was an absolute strength of the division, that we had that level of continuity. Because, of course, when I come in 2021, just like each of us, like all of a sudden, all the things that you don't necessarily predict, or even those things you can predict, are starting to happen, and inevitably will happen in terms of the things that you face from a threat perspective. To answer your question, Kelly, when I came in November of 21, we were immediately, of course, dealing with the aftermath of the January 6th attacks, and what was the largest FBI investigation in history around what the FBI characterized as a domestic terrorism event. In a few months after I got there, Russia invades Ukraine. We are still dealing with the idea that we're going to have to reauthorize FISA 702 in a year, and that's hanging over our heads. We are facing, to your guys' points, kind of consistent attacks from China on our infrastructure, whether it's through cyber means or other, stealing our sensitive technology, and trying to use our laws to protect us in that way. We find out that there's likely classified information at a house in Mar-a-Lago that we have to deal with in the early part of 2022. And we're consistently facing also the threat of terrorism. So all of that is happening, and a lot of it you couldn't predict. You could see the 702 fight coming right from a mile away, but the rest is the way it goes when it comes to national security. You have to be ready to defend the country and adapt, and the strength of the division being that we had this consistency of leadership from one administration to the next that was apolitical, career folks who were in the right positions lead the division to take on these challenges, and those challenges just obviously kept coming for the next, during my time for the next several years. But I'll just reiterate what John said. I mean, even as we said, part of it we had gotten really good on the CT fight, but we faced a lot of threats on the nation state side, not just China, but also Iran. I should have mentioned Iran lethal plotting inside the United States, still in response to the killing of Soleimani, Qasem Soleimani, and that was a huge challenge for the division. So the theme, though, of building on the past and the work of our predecessors, my predecessors, and adapting to the threat, as supported by sort of a remarkable group of career leaders.
Mm-hmm. No, it's really, really interesting, and I think kind of that through line of just the relationship that all of you have, and just the leadership that all of you have taken on during leading the division. I sort of wanted to ask this question. I always think it's really interesting when you look back and think about like what was an unexpected challenge that you had to face, right? Because like you all, you're getting briefed right before your confirmation. You kind of know what the deal is, what the landscape is. So I'm curious about, and Ken, I'm going to start with you, in case you're getting back into the conversation here. But I would love to just hear from you about like. What was an unexpected challenge?
The resident wallflower.
Was it? Yeah. I thought he might have left you here. Yeah.
Sorry.
Wake him up.
Come on. That was the program. What would you say would be like an unexpected challenge that you faced when you got to NSD?
Actually, I mean, this shouldn't have been unexpected, but it was the amount that we had to focus on FISA. I think when I stepped in, Jack Livingston to the FBI, I probably could spell FISA, but that's about it. And worked, really sort of started to learn FISA over there, the practice of it, the process of it. But it was coming in, and I guess I just hadn't gamed this out of my mind as to how much of a focus it would be. It, as Matt emphasized, terrorist surveillance program was an incredibly important part of our toolkit, and it was on the way out, and we were looked to sort of get a solution. And of course, we had really great people like John Eisenberg and Steve Bradbury and others we worked with. But at the end of the day, it was our job to navigate through this, and this was everything from we got to get into the FISA court and get as much of the body of surveillances that are being done under the terrorist surveillance program under FISA court authority. And we had to use some creative theories, and we got that. We got one order. This is all public now, one order and then a second order. But we were sort of losing coverage from order to order. And then it was, we need a legislative solution, and so we worked closely with DNI. Ben Powell's over there. He was very much involved in this. Brett Gary and team sort of pulled together a draft proposal that then got completely revamped and ultimately became the FISA Amendments Act that came out in the summer of 2008. But that whole series of events, from getting the FISA Court Authority, renewing the FISA Court Authority, getting what was sort of the Band-Aid temporary legislation, the Protect America Act, which is basically the paradigm that ultimately got incorporated into the FISA Amendments Act for FISA coverage, and then getting that into the FISA Amendments Act was like a 3-year process, and it took an unbelievable amount of time. And I spent a lot of time testifying and sort of learning about the far parts of the FISA test and the kind of stuff that Jack had tried to teach me, and I couldn't figure it out. But really had to learn that, and that was fascinating challenge. But I didn't expect that, because I was a meat and potatoes prosecutor basically most of my career, so I was very focused on the prosecution side, and I ended up spending a lot of time with these guys on the FISA side.
Interesting. John Carlin, what would you say?
You're bringing me back. So, so I was in the spirit of long time to take a confirmation. I was an acting assistant attorney general for about a year beforehand. We had this very clear theory of the case as to how we were going to transform the division, and there were twin shocks, I think. One was this guy, Edward Snowden, probably everyone's, what? People remember? So there was the Snowden disclosures, and that was occurring right at the time where we were thinking that our key strategic pivot was trying to develop relationships with the private sector, and particularly those who are innovating on technology. And so there was both kind of the actual legal challenges and ultimately a case in that regard, and the triage on figuring out what was taken, and then the impact that it had on FISA court and opinions, but also really something that I wasn't thinking about as being on the plate, and was very antithetical to the culture, not just of the National Security Division, but the whole national security community. Or as I remember the deputy over the time, Chris Inglis, always used to joke about having to pivot from being no such agency to suddenly having to do a public relations campaign. But it was critical to the mission, ultimately, that America had to know what authorities and tools were being used, have trust in the use of those, which ultimately up to the American people and Congress, how much scope to give the community in the collection. They need to understand it, understand what the risks are, make a conscious decision, and then we need to abide and execute with what that shift is. So we had that, and then we had the Boston Marathon attack. And I know we have some members of the media today, but I remember one particular one pointing this out. So we're out trying to develop relations, which means we're taking more questions from the media and doing external events, particularly on the West Coast. And a reporter attacking me about how could it be, this is defending a historical program now, how could it be that you collected the hardline telephone numbers of so many Americans, and this would be at a time, I think, that unlike now, where I think my daughter called a hardline telephone, she brought one in for Ancient Technology Day at her school, but it had already really pivoted to mobile at the time that this controversy was hitting around the 215 program. So at the one time, he would say, how could that possibly be? Isn't that a problem with civil liberties? And then, without taking a breath, said it's outrageous that the FBI wasn't able to run a photograph identification database. I don't know how many of you remember the Sun Boston Marathon, but we had the photo, and it took so long to do the identity. And in fairness, I think that reflects just a fundamental kind of where most Americans are. We want both, and there's some tension between the two. So those two shocks, and then trying to figure out with the career leadership, including Adam, how to build trust again with the community where we needed to share information if we could help protect against things like both the national security cyber threat, and then again, the terrorists were using the tools that we were producing to cause that iteration of the terrorist threat. And so that was all occurring at the same time.
John Demers, unexpected challenge.
Yeah. You. But just kidding. Yeah. No. I think, well, for me, what was unexpected was seeing the shift in the politics around surveillance. So building on, what John was saying. So, when the FISA Amendments Act passed in 2008, we had a Republican president, President Bush. We had a Democratic Congress, and it passed, with basically every Republican, with one or two exceptions, voting yes, and probably more than half of the Democrats voting yes. And honestly, had it been a Democratic president, you probably would add more Democrats. That's normal. But by the time you get past, when I was there, you get to 2018, the politics around surveillance were so much more complicated, right? The Republicans were very split between the types of folks who worked on the Intelligence Committee and the types of folks who worked on the Judiciary Committee. And the Democratic Party was also more split. There were more folks on the left and there were more folks on the right who were opponents of the kind of surveillance programs we were trying to do. And each time you kind of, and FISA, by the way, the adoption and the renewal of FISA, I think, is a consistent thing that all of us had to do, and helped one another do from the outside. But that just the math got harder and harder in Congress, and obviously we're seeing that right now in one of its most difficult renewal periods. I still think it'll be renewed ultimately, because it is that critical to the intelligence community right now and to national security right now. But that was a surprise to me, was how much the politics on the Hill had changed around this issue.
Matt,
Yeah,
what do you
I was going to
think?
say the same thing, John.
Sorry.
Sorry, I got to think of something else. No, but because I had this, we all had that experience, and I definitely had that experience. And going back to 2008, I mean, people in this room were there, Ben Powell, Jack Livingston, like people who worked on it, and there was like this real bipartisan. When you had the national security argument, you had the wind at your back. And that just had changed so significantly I saw it change from the outside, so it wasn't so surprising. But to experience it firsthand from the inside was both surprising and sort of discouraging. And to broaden out the point, I guess, to build on your point, John, it wasn't just surveillance. I remember testifying in January of 2022, so I'd been in the position for just a couple months, in the Senate Judiciary Committee on domestic terrorism. And it was myself and an executive from the FBI, and it was parallel universes in that committee on like how they saw the threat. So that was a real change from the past, where there would be there might be different views, policy views on how to respond to the threat and what the tools are and how to use those tools, but you could sort of count on the idea that the way the threat would be assessed based on the view of the intelligence community and would be largely an apolitical exercise. And it just was very challenging to be in a hearing talking about domestic terrorism as a threat and have just such different perspectives depending on party affiliation, and that just makes your job as a career national security person at the Justice Department or a political person like I was, but just leading a division that's responsible for addressing that threat, including prosecuting individuals who violate U.S. laws, makes it really hard. And that's a challenge I think we all face, and now I think it's now we're seeing it with the 702 debate as well. So it's a challenge. I think that was a bit of a surprise to me.
So I'm going to just ask one more question down the line, and then I think we have a couple of minutes for Q&A from the audience. But I wanted to just ask all of you, given your background, experience, what do you think, like, the next 5 years, like, what will the challenges be for the division? What would you say, like, kind of going forward in the future, you think kind of how this threat landscape is going to evolve? What do you think is going to be there?
Well, I think I'll start.
Yeah.
I think, look, the beauty of the National Security Division is it's done an exceptional job over the years of trying to stay above and outside of politics. And I think that's a credit to all the professional staff and the folks who've been selected to lead that division. It's really important that it remains that way, and they've done a great job of that up to today. But politics impacts what we do. And so I'm basically just going to repeat what John and Matt said. I think, I don't see the politics in this space, especially in the surveillance space, getting any easier. I mean, I can tell you, like, one of our closest allies getting the FISA Amendments Act was Sheldon Whitehouse. Yeah. He pushed hard for civil liberties protections and the like, but then you'll recall we spent a lot of time working with him, and that's the way it was when you went up there arguing for national security authorities that you could make a good case for, and people from both sides of the aisle would work with you. That's broken down, and I just see that as really, it could be crippling, and my hope is that politics, and that has been happening for a while, right? That's happened over time. I mean, there were seeds of it. So, for example, you talked about the RD split. Remember, most of the Republican members would be with a proposal, especially obviously if President Bush backed it. There were some, though. There was sort of those who were kind of on the libertarian side, or whatever, who wouldn't, and we get called in to go work on those members in particular. So it was there then, but it's really ramped up, and I just see that that's going to, for purposes of the mission, especially surveillance mission, that's going to continue to be a problem, and it's going to limit our capabilities.
I was thinking of an example of how we get wrong. When we were predicting what it would look like if a rogue nuclear-armed nation attacked the United States through cyber means, we did many, many war games over the years around the water grid, electric, nuclear supply. And then the first really major shocking attack was about a major motion movie picture about a bunch of pot-smoking journalists. Only time in my career I've had to go situation room and brief the president, start with a plot synopsis. And for those of you who've seen the movie, The Interview, it's not an easy movie to characterize and give a quick synopsis of, but it really irritated the leader of North Korea. And so I doubt I'll get the factual scenario right on what occurs in the next 5 years, but echoing, I think, some of the themes here, it's one, relied so much on the career expertise, both because of the deep knowledge of what the threat was. Secondly, there's some very obscure areas of law, and like Ken, I'd come up on the criminal side, so needing to rely on Tosh here and others, but on what those authorities are and how they've been interpreted over time. Third is just the perspective of seeing that pendulum shift wildly. So whichever phase you were in, you were surrounded by folks who had been there when it had swung wildly on the we need every possible authority that we have to we really want to emphasize civil liberties and can help keep that perspective. So I think critical over the next 5 years is trying to maintain that nonpartisan cadre of experts. And then the other part of that expertise, I think, was that I don't know if they had the wisdom when they created the division to see this, but what really paid off for the Justice Department, who's not so integrated into the intelligence community and has these other missions, was that cadre married up to the career professionals who are at the agency, who are at NSA, who are at other parts of the community, and that relationship of trust outside changes in legal authorities is what allowed us to get that accurate portrait of what the intelligence showed the threat was and share information effectively. So I do worry now, an increased time of partisanship. Are we going to maintain those folks who have that muscle memory?
John, any predictions?
Well, look, I think organizationally it's going to be a rebuilding over the next few years. I see NSD has posted for any number of jobs. They do have authority to hire and budget to hire, but they're, I don't know what the exact numbers are, but they're operating at a much lower level of individuals than were there certainly by the end of Matt's time, but even when I was there. And so there's going to have to be a lot of rebuilding there, and I'm glad to see that they've started doing it. And then I think, like John, who knows? But one theme that's going to continue is technological evolution and what that means for national security threats and what expertise you're going to need there. And working with the IC, as John said, to address that, because that is, I do think beyond kind of the national security politics and the changes that have occurred, there's just a broader, what does everybody make of government, a theme that's going on right now in the U.S. and also this ambivalent relationship we have with technology, how much we use, how much we put on publicly about ourselves, how much data about ourselves we're willing to share with the private sector, with advertisers, with companies we order from, how much we love the convenience of all of that, and then how much it makes us nervous to know that all sorts of folks have access to all that information. And so I think that'll be, on the policy side, that'll be a real debate over the next 5 years and more.
Yeah, I mean, the technology point, I think John is exactly right. Where the threats will change from various sources, whether it's the countries that we're most concerned about, whether it's terrorism related or cyber related, but the sort of overarching challenge will be continued pace of change in terms of technology that's available to our adversaries, and whether we can adapt, and whether our laws and rules and policies will continue. I mean, they will inevitably lag behind technological change. That's the state of play. But can we continue to stay apace, at least, in how we're able to both address technological threats and then also use those technological advantages to, protect our national security. So that's one. But the other, and I just agree, there's going to be a need to be your guys' points on the people, because all of this is hard to predict. But we know we're going to have to continue to recruit and train and retain really, really top-notch people, and that's never really been a problem. And honestly, while the numbers are way down, and the Justice Department went to Congress and said we need more people, CES is down like 40%, and that's really concerning because of the importance of those roles. I think on the good news side, at least anecdotally, there are so many people who want to work in the National Security Division, and they want to go back to government when they feel like they can, and when there's the opportunity. So I don't think there's any shortage of people who want to go into these jobs who are really, really talented, and we'll be able to rebuild the division from where it is now in terms of the number of people that are career folks working on these challenges. So I'm optimistic about our ability to address that challenge.
No, super interesting. I do feel like it was interesting to me that in the recent AI executive order, the Attorney General has been there's a provision in there about sort of enhancing or focusing on crimes involving AI and computer crimes, which I thought was just a really kind of interesting future point of what's going to happen, having the folks with the expertise technologically to understand kind of where things are going, how crimes are being committed, and how best to counter them. So I think a lot of really interesting points here today. I just want to open it up. I think do we have any time for questions? Maybe a couple of minutes?
Yeah, we have time for questions. What we'd like to do, if folks could raise their hands, we have a mic that will come to you. Kelli will call on people, and it'd be great if you could identify yourself or with affiliation and pose your question. No speeches, please. We like questions.
I think
That's fine.
Thank you. Thank you for your collective service and individual service and the support you give into our committee. So my question is a little bit kind of based on your public service and now the fact that you guys all are in the private sector. So in the private sector, one of the big issues that we confront are cyber breaches, and particularly in the defense industrial base. And as you guys know, the lawyers usually come in and sign non-disclosure agreements, and there's usually quite a debate about what's appropriate to be able to tell to the government. You guys uniquely have served on both sides of that sort of V, and I'm wondering, do you think we need any more changes, more authorities? What is it? Because it's clear a lot is going on in that private space, and it's unclear how it's really being reported to the government, NSA, Cybercom, and DCSA. So I'm kind of curious, based on your experience on both sides, do you think we need some reform? What would that forum look like?
It's been interesting. It's you put it in the context of the defense industrial base, because I actually think that's an area where there's been just marked improvement. If I go back to maybe where it was in early 2000s to where it is today, it's rather remarkable how much it's changed. I think through good work in part by NSA along with other members of the Defense Department to really focus on trying to, there's this, it's almost become like a drinking game or a joke on public-private partnership being invoked when it comes to combating the cyber threats. But I think the shift has been away from strategic intelligence and really focusing on operational, actionable intelligence shared in time for the private sector company to protect itself, and vice versa. And there were reasons, it kind of touches on the themes that we've had here. I mean, I think there are important reasons around government authority, concerns about privacy, about why there were restrictions in that space, but they've worked out now, particularly in defense industrial base, a way of sharing that information at speed and scale. Where there are gaps, or to look at is, and what is critical infrastructure when we consider the technological changes that are occurring now? So how far down the supply chain do you need to go to prevent a critical shock to our system in the event of a conflict, in particular with a foreign power, as we shift towards artificial intelligence? To use a concrete one everyone's wrestling with now, we have companies developing this incredible capacity to spot vulnerabilities and exploit them. You hear that discussed in the Anthropic's mythos, but really it's true of all the three big providers, and it's really a step change. Like, we've never had before this ability to spot a vulnerability in code and then develop the ability to exploit, develop the capability to exploit that vulnerability at speed and scale, where you don't need to be very sophisticated to use the tool. So we've developed that capacity for offense on the one hand, and on defense, once it gets applied, you could also use it to build code that doesn't have the vulnerability in the first instance, or red team. We've paused now the big three, and there's this question of who gets access to the tool before it's released to the public in order to patch. Again, I think traditional defense industrial base will probably be covered, but what about all the dependent companies now who are smaller tech that they rely upon? What about the companies that are developing the semiconductors that sit underneath the technology that they use? And who's going to win this race? Those are American companies who are willing to pause and share the information. But I think the expectation now is some of our countries that are not going to share that information are about 6 months away from developing the same capability. So I think we're in for a shocking, a time of authorities and funding on almost every company. And I'm curious, John, from just for your perspective, where you sit too, but almost every company now has been using a model to protect itself on cybersecurity that's going to be outmoded. And we're going to be in this race to come up with a new model to pay down tech debt and get new hardware and software before this capability becomes widely available to criminal groups and nation-state actors. And I think it's going to be spending on a scale that's going to be like a slight, it'll be opportunities for some and a slight drag on the economy for others as we try to meet that challenge. I'm not sure right now we have the authorities in place or kind of drive to get that message out across the private sector. But here's your perspective, sitting in partly in DIB, partly out.
Yeah, I mean, on the DIB point, I agree with you. We get excellent information from the government right now on cybersecurity breaches and threats, and we share information in a way that, I didn't expect necessarily coming at it from the government side, but that I think is being, such a big part of our business is defense contracting, and the relationships with the government are that close and mature. On your last point, yes, I mean, the investment that is going to be needed to keep up with the new models is going to be tremendous. Just the speed of patching that's going to have to occur across systems, the volume of patching, I mean, just the volume of undetected openings in software right now that this software is going to be able to find is tremendous, and their early sort of work has already shown that. Even openings that have existed for 20 years that no one ever found, much faster than any set of the best human engineers could could put together. And so that's going to be a big investment, but also a big change in the model that companies have been using about, how to test, how to patch, just that pace of all that, which by now actually has gotten pretty routine, at least at big companies.
I'll just pause on that, though, just like one statistic. It's gotten, if you look at the stats for 2025, of the top 10 vulnerabilities that were exploited by criminal groups, 3 of them were vulnerabilities that everyone had known about for more than 10 years. Of the top 100, it was a third. So that was current state. And then
And then you got this.
Then you had this.
So the volume, the pace, it's going to require an enormous investment. And again, I do think a lot of the big companies can do it, and they'll feel responsible for doing it. But you've got a supply chain that goes down into privately owned family shops, and supply chain vulnerabilities are a big issue too on the cyber side, and that I think is going to be really tough. There's Miss Microsoft waiting to profit from it all.
Oh, that, right, I think he's got his hand up.
Yeah, hi, Howard Marks. I worked in the federal government for almost 48 years, including military service. Thank you for your service. My question, I think that John Carlin mentioned this earlier, was the human bombs, the threat that we face. I'm thinking of the first anniversary of the killings at the Washington Jewish Museum. People who are being targeted by those who were not necessarily working for foreign agents or not foreign agents. They've been indoctrinated over social media, whether it's TikTok or whether it's other avenues, to not just hate others, but to kill them. I think you talked about, the killing of police and so on, maybe the assassination attempts against the president also. People who are acting on social media to kill others, based on information supplied in many cases by foreign governments on social media through cutouts like TikTok and so on. What do we do about it? I mean, the social libertarians would say, no, we can't do anything, but people are being killed daily on the streets of America because of their race, ethnic, or religion, and so on. I'd like to hear a little discussion about what can we do. Thank you.
Matthew, I know you spent a lot of time.
I can start. I mean, we did deal with this problem quite a bit over the past several years, as we've sort of seen, I think, statistics bear out a rise in political violence and hate-based violence. There is a fundamental challenge that is beyond the ability of the National Security Division and the lawyers there to address, right? I mean, which is, as you said, the people being easily radicalized on the internet, not necessarily having any particular ideological bent, not necessarily being connected to a foreign terrorist organization, but perhaps they are, but not always. And but then you combine on top of that the availability of very soft targets, whether it's religious organizations and buildings or shopping malls or bars, all the places that people gather, and then on top of that, the availability of military-grade weapons in this country. So as long as you have those elements, this is a challenge that is going to be beyond the capacity of our law enforcement and Department of Justice and local prosecutors to handle. So I'm not really answering your question about what to do about it. I will say what I saw work quite well, again, kind of turning inward a little bit to the Department of Justice, is a very strong relationship between the National Security Division and the Civil Rights Division, which typically handles hate crimes, and the ability to quickly discern what was going to be the best tool to go after somebody who's been identified as a threat or who's been after an attack, to prosecute that person. And I think broadening out that point, just the willingness to use the best tool to address the threat, I thought was a real strength of what I saw within the National Security Division and the Department of Justice over the past few years.
Hi, I'm Rash Jain, Canadian lawyer, recently graduated from my National Security Law LLM at Georgetown. Thank you. Voice accent. My question's in the vein of that discussion at the end on future threats and keeping pace with emerging technologies. We recently had a mass shooting in British Columbia, Canada, where the shooter was encouraged and given instruction to commit their heinous act by ChatGPT. This prompted widespread outrage, and OpenAI is now in discussions at the ministerial level in Canada to review their safeguards and ensure something like this doesn't happen again. In the case of an AI model facilitating an adverse national security event in the US, do you think the NSD has a role to play in assigning liability, investigating, or pursuing accountability? Thank you.
I should answer it. I think Kelly should answer it, actually. I mean, from our perspective, it's really the criminal side of things, right? So civil liability, I think, is a whole other issue of these models and the folks who are making these models. I mean, on the criminal side, you know, a case like that would be challenging to bring against the company criminal in the United States, for sure. I mean, and you know, so I don't know that.
I'll give a slight pivot on it, because where I would see a role for National Security Division, whether it's prompt injection or otherwise, would be, you know, we've seen each time with new technology, adversaries figure out a way to turn it to their ends, and so if a adversary nation state was attempting to use the tool in order to cause violence inside the United States, and I think the National Security Division would have a critical role in figuring out what had happened, working to deter it, and then using all tools of federal government to hold that nation state to account. And then similarly, I think you could see terrorist groups following, trying to follow at least a similar model, just like they did with social media, to try to use the tool, despite the safeguards that were built in by the designers of the tool, to carry out their means, and that again would be a role for the division.
Can I just add one quick point, which is to say, I mean, so John Demers was one of the very first leaders of the law and policy section within the National Security Division, and that was when it was like 2 people, and when I left it was like 45 or so people, lawyers, and they would deal with these kinds of issues, right? Like, how do you think about legislation? What's the position of the Department of Justice when it comes to policies and legislation dealing with emerging threats? And having that capacity within the government, you know, headquartered in the National Security Division, was a real strength for the department.
Yeah, I was just going to echo that point, that there is an important role that NSD has in the law and policy area, and sort of looking down the road at what the next threats are, and then thinking about what legislations can best meet those threats. And just to echo what you said about, you know, how AI is a game changer, you know, just at a meeting here about the role of AI in enhancing the bio threat to America and the world, and the fact that AI can be used to just create these pathogens in a way that just, you know, completely accelerates the process. And what we heard from Anthropic and OpenAI this morning about what they're doing to try to prevent people from using that tool to come up with a bioweapon, and you know, it just completely changes the game. And so that's the kind of thing where, you know, there's room for a legislative solution, and you know, you need some smart people thinking about it, and the 45 people that Matt was talking about should be on it, because they're thinking down the road as to what the next national security threat is. And you're right, AI is going to be right in the middle of that threat.
So, Kelli Andrews, gentlemen, we thank you for your...
All right. And thank you for listening to NSLT. Remember to subscribe to NSLT on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon, whatever you like to listen to. Remember to like and share this episode with a friend. The writer, producer, and host of NSLT is me, Elisa Poteet. I'm always here in my individual capacity. Our editor, my co-producer, is Francis Burkham. I am always accompanied by the never stops, never runs out of energy, Holly McMahon, who's also the co-producer of this cast. Our program manager is the ever lovely, wonderful, hardworking Antasia Hawkins Blakeney. Social media and research support comes from Alana Coopersmith. And of course, we get so much help from the brilliant minds of the members of the Standing Committee on Law and National Security, who pursue the good in the interest of national security without regard for politics. And you should do the same. We'll see you next time.
The views expressed on national security law today have not been approved by the House of Delegates or the Board of Governors of the American Bar Association, and this recording should not be construed as representing ABA policy.